On today's episode of May the Record Reflect.
From an advocate's perspective, from a trial lawyer's perspective, rhetorical devices help us simplify and clarify what might be overwhelming or convoluted concepts for our lay jurors. And devices like analogies and metaphors can simplify complex ideas, make them easier to understand and more relatable. And that clarity can be just as satisfying because it reduces the cognitive load and makes us feel less overwhelmed by a topic or less lost in a discussion. Another reason that rhetoric works so well for us as trial lawyers and advocates is that they help our persuasion and helps move our listeners to action and enables them to internalize the theory of our case and make that message part of their core belief system so they can act in a way that would benefit our client or benefit the case.
That was Marian Grace Braccia. And this is May the Record Reflect. Hello, and welcome to the 58th episode of the monthly podcast of the National Institute for Trial Advocacy. I'm your host, Marcy Mankin. Finally, after a long, hot summer, it is fall. And May the Record Reflect is taking advantage of that great back-to-school vibe with an episode with a decidedly academic bent. We are dusting off our textbooks to talk about the wisdom of rhetoricians, both old and new, ancient and modern, and how rhetorical techniques are not only critical to your legal arguments, but you're probably already using some of them without even realizing it. Our guest, Marian Grace Braccia, is here to break it all down. She is the director of the LLM in Trial Advocacy and a practice professor of law at Temple University School of Law, where she brings to the classroom particular expertise in courtroom technology, e-discovery issues, and trial skills. She is an accomplished litigator, having served as an assistant DA in the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office for 12 years prior to joining the faculty at Temple Law. Marian Grace is a frequent presenter on gender bias in the courtroom, particularly as it impacts transgender and gender-diverse people and cisgender women. Through Temple's Chilean pre-LLM program, she teaches lawyers the fundamentals of trial advocacy in Chile, Argentina, Ecuador, and Peru. But today she's here on the podcast to talk about rhetoric for trial lawyers. Here's our interview. Marian Grace, welcome. I am so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to be talking with you about one of my favorite things.
It is one of your favorite things, and ancient Greek rhetoric is kind of a big C classical niche for a lawyer. So I'm wondering how this passion came about. Were you an English major, or how did it start?
I was not an English major. It's actually something that I regret a lot. I had started out as a comparative literature major, but switched to urban studies as a major as an undergrad. But I actually fell in love with rhetoric as a result of an art history class that I took as an undergrad. So we're going back almost 25 years. And I just came upon this image, this what's known as philosophy in the liberal arts. It's a plate from the Hortus Deliciarum, which means the Garden of Luxuries, and it was in a textbook, and it's a beautiful image, portrait painting of Queen Philosophy, who is seated in the middle of this plate, and she is surrounded by the 7 liberal arts, and they're all depicted as women or goddesses in robes with various props with them that represent their art. And I was just really taken by this image. By way of a little bit of history or background, it was created by Herod of Landsberg and a community of women who studied in the Vosges Mountains around the 12th century. And if you see this, and I really encourage everyone to search it and to look for it because it really is beautiful. Queen Philosophy has this beautiful crown and she's wearing red and blue robes. And as I said, she's surrounded by the 7 liberal arts, and she has words inscribed around her that say, I, the divine, of course, this is in Latin, but it says, the translation is, I, the divine philosophy, govern all things wisely. I lay out 7 arts which are subordinate to me. And the 7 arts are grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. And of course, the 3 language arts, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, are known as the trivium, and the 4 number arts, music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, are known as the quadrivium. And so I just started looking into a little bit of the background, a little bit of what came of this image and how it informed so much afterwards. And it really has a strong relationship to the world of liberal arts education. And if we think about the quadrivium or the number arts with the trivium or the letter arts, we're tempted to think that there is a distinction and a separation between the arts and the sciences. But really, I think we should regard all of the liberal arts as the experience of working productively with the tension of theory and practice. And ultimately, isn't that what we as trial lawyers do? We think about the theory of our case, we study the doctrine of the law, we interpret statutes, and then we practice it. We put it into doing or making or storytelling. And so that's kind of where it came from. And I don't ever think that we as modern day litigators or trial lawyers should forget about classical rhetoric, because it really does still inform so much of what we do in modern trial advocacy.
That is a beautiful background. I love knowing that. When people hear the term rhetoric, they often think of empty words used to make empty promises, or speaking with the silver tongue, or maybe they associate it with debate at best and trickery at worst. So what is the actual definition of rhetoric?
So rhetoric, according to Aristotle, means persuasion by all available means. And I'm interested in the different forms of communication. I've also heard it said and written that the most effective communicator is the one who can tailor the message to any audience that is listening to that message. And so that really is the going back, it goes to the philosophy of rhetoric. It's using all available forms of communication and persuasion to deliver a message. And interestingly, in that same plate, in that same piece of art that depicts Queen Philosophy and the 7 arts around her, rhetoric, or the image of rhetoric, is a woman dressed in a blue robe. She's holding up a stylus, a writing instrument, and a pair of wax-coated tablets. And that's supposed to represent the great care that the orator, that the speaker should devote to preparing their speeches. And there are numerous revisions necessary. There is rewriting, rethinking, a lot of practice that goes into rhetoric. And she says, in the words that are inscribed above the rhetoric's arch, say, "Thanks to me, proud speaker, your speeches will move." And I mentioned that, I want to mention that in conjunction with her friend who's right next to her left, who's dialectic. And dialectic is in a green robe, and she's depicted with the head of a barking dog, and she's engaged in this lively exchange. And that barking dog is intended to represent the energy and the regularity of argumentation. And it's also supposed to remind us of the intense vigilance that we should have when arguing with an opponent. And dialectic, above her inscription, says, like the barks of a dog, my arguments follow each other with speed. So really, we're talking about, rhetoric talks about thinking about the argument, thinking about the audience and what they need at any given time to be persuaded. We're talking about the vigilance necessary to encounter an opponent or a contrary argument. And we're talking about the great work that goes into the background of developing those arguments, writing those arguments, rethinking, reworking, tweaking, refining those arguments. And that is all a very heavy undertaking, and not just something that is meant to play mind games or engage in trickery or anything that's meant to manipulate. It really is an art to deliver a message in a way that will best be received.
It's fascinating. I'm going to be researching the Queen philosophy, and I will include a link in the show notes. But today we're going to focus on a very specific part of rhetoric, and it's called rhetorical devices. What is a rhetorical device?
So most simply, a rhetorical device is a technique that an author or a speaker may use to convey meaning or to persuade or to evoke an emotional response from the audience. And rhetorical devices can enhance arguments. They can make speeches more compelling. They can help the reader or the listener understand the message more deeply. They can simplify concepts or theories. And rhetorical devices can really be found in all forms of communication, in written or in spoken communication. And even I encourage you to pay attention to certainly the media, to politics, but even in marketing and advertising, you see rhetorical devices employed all the time.
So, Marian Grace, you've told us about this incredible painting, which you said is from the 12th century, but in fact, rhetoric is much older than that, centuries older. So I wonder if you could give just a brief overview of the most important rhetoricians of the ancient past, the granddaddies of rhetoric, so to speak.
Absolutely, the OGs. I'm sure they would appreciate being called the OGs of rhetoric. So the development of ancient rhetoric can really be traced back to the Sophists in the 5th century BC in Greece. And the Sophists were traveling teachers, and they claimed to teach success in public life through the art of persuasion. Some of the criticism of the Sophists, though, is that their approach was pragmatic and often focused on winning arguments rather than seeking truth. So kind of a win at all costs mentality. And key figures of the 5th century and early Sophists were figures like Protagoras and Gorgias, and they were among the earliest proponents of the art of rhetoric. And so as rhetoric evolved, it became much more structured and philosophical, with contributions from figures like Aristotle, that I'll talk about in just a second, and Cicero, who I have a particular affinity for, and I'll tell you why. But the study of rhetoric became a central component of education in the classical world, and it influenced both public speaking and effective writing. And so the rhetoricians and their works laid the foundation for the study and the practice of rhetoric that we know today, that continues to influence modern communication and literature and public discourse. So the real OG, the original granddaddy, was Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote Rhetoric, which was the foundational text in the study of rhetoric. He defined rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. And of course, he gave us also the 3 pillars of rhetoric, which are ethos, or the credibility of the speaker, pathos, or the emotional appeal, the emotional response of the audience, and logos, which is logical argument. Going back a little before, maybe about 100 years before Aristotle, was, of course, Socrates. And Socrates gave us the Socratic method. So many of my lawyer colleagues will remember that, hopefully fondly, from law school. And the Socratic method is the eliciting of truth through questions and dialogue. And so while Socrates didn't write any texts himself, his methods and his ideas were recorded by his student, the most notable of whom was Plato. And Socrates emphasized the importance of questions and questioning and dialogue in order to discover the truth. And that concept continued through Plato's writings and Socrates, and all the way through to the Romans. Cicero is a favorite of mine because I was raised on Cicero. There's a fun picture of me as a baby surrounded by the classical works of Cicero and De Inventione and his handbook for orators. So my dad is a Cicerophile, if that's a word, and he's written historical fiction and wrote a novel about the life and times and trials and tribulations and the eventual exile of Marcus Tullius Cicero. But Cicero, I think, is so special in the study of rhetoric because he believed that the power of persuasion, the ability to verbally manipulate opinion in crucial political decisions was a key issue. It was of utmost importance, and that in the hands of an unprincipled orator, that power would endanger the entire community. And that's something I think that not only applies to trial lawyers and is important for our ethical considerations as advocates in a courtroom, but it's certainly an issue that is alive and well with all of the political discourse that we see and hear. So Cicero contributed so greatly to the works on rhetoric. He gave us De Inventione when he was a younger man, and that outlined the 5 canons of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And then when he was a bit more refined and mature, about 12 years before his death, he wrote De Oratore, which is intended to be the greatest work on guiding oratory, but from a more mature, refined, eloquent perspective. And then, of course, his colleague, who was just a few years younger than him, I should say his contemporary, Quintilian, also wrote in Institutio Oratoria, which is the comprehensive guide to rhetoric, and he was certainly a strong advocate for the ethical use of rhetoric. His Quintilian's key concept was the good man speaking well equals the importance of education in rhetoric. So all of these were some of the greatest contributors that we still reference and we still rely on when it comes to using rhetorical devices effectively, but using rhetorical devices ethically as well.
Oh man, Cicero. You know, I probably should not be copping to this publicly, but I took a legal rhetoric class when I was in grad school. And one of the assigned texts early in the semester was Cicero's De Oratore. And I remember being in tears of frustration one Sunday morning, facing down my all of my homework, because the language and the concepts were so much of a stretch for me to grasp. And now, 30 years hence, I'm trying to remember if Cicero was a lawyer and a politician himself.
Most certainly he was. Yes, most certainly he was. And known also for his own oratory and for quite literally writing the book for others to follow on being effective orators.
So no wonder he was concerned about the misuse of the power of persuasion.
Yes, and the effect of that in our society.
Are there any other more recent writers that we might be familiar with who are known for using rhetoric? And by recent, I mean even, 500 years ago.
Sure. So we can jump 500 years or so. We could even jump to the 20th century. But if we want to jump 500 years, then I think the person that we have to mention is William Shakespeare, of course. And Shakespeare is renowned for his masterful use of rhetorical devices through plays and sonnets, and has books written on just picking apart thousands upon thousands of lines of dialogue and poetry, and the explication of rhetorical devices that are sometimes, there are multiple rhetorical devices used sometimes in just one line of poetry or a sonnet. It's really beautiful.
Yes. Yes. I was an English major, and one of my favorite films of all time is Kenneth Branagh's Henry V. To me, he is generational Shakespearean, and
Mm.
for me, set the bar. I mean, I think there's no one who just like grabs my heart the way that he does, and this film is why. And when I was thinking about Shakespeare to prepare for this, I was remembering my favorite scene, and it came out when I was in the movie came out when I was in college, and back then we didn't have videotapes or on demand or anything like that until at least maybe a year after the movie had come out. You get the VCR, and so every time I wanted to see the movie, I had to go to the movie theater, and I probably went at least a dozen times. And the reason was because I loved St. Crispin's Day speech, which has been evoked countless times by countless leaders over at least decades, if not centuries, because it is so, so inspiring. And there's something about
it. Was even in a Danny DeVito movie. It was in Renaissance Man.
You're kidding.
It was.
It has eternal appeal, and I will include a link to that so that people can watch it, and then I encourage you to watch the entire movie too. But anyway, there's something about rhetorical devices, when beautifully deployed, that makes our brains and our hearts just feel so good, and they can inspire us to action. What is it that makes rhetorical devices so satisfying to us?
So I think a few things, broken down maybe into three categories. One is at the neurological level. One is on the artistic level and our desire as human beings for art. And then lastly, perhaps as lawyers, as advocates, as advocacy students, there's a third prong that would be most pertinent to us as advocates. And so I think to answer your question, why we crave and respond so well and so much to rhetoric and rhetorical devices. Number one, on that neuro level, because there's pattern recognition. Our brains are wired to recognize patterns, and many rhetorical devices create patterns in speech or writing. Devices like alliteration or parallelism and anaphora. It provides a sense of rhythm and order that is pleasing to both the ear and the mind. And there's cognitive engagement. The rhetorical devices engage the cognitive process, and they make us think more deeply about the message. Devices like metaphors and analogies require us to make a connection between different concepts, and that stimulates our brain. I was raised on 90s alt rock, so there's an Alanis Morissette song that says, "You held your breath and the door for me," and that use of the verb in two completely different contexts makes us stop and perk up and pay attention and go through that interpretation and analysis, and that's something that our brains crave. And then next, on an artistic level, rhetoric and the effective deployment of rhetorical devices gives us emotional resonance and memory enhancement and aesthetic pleasure, and even surprise and novelty. Some rhetorical devices like irony or puns introduce the element of surprise and novelty, and they can be amusing or thought-provoking, and they make the message more engaging, more memorable. I will say, for the aesthetic side of things, when I say the aesthetic pleasure that we can derive from rhetorical devices, that the use of language in a beautiful or clever way can provide an aesthetic pleasure. It can be very satisfying or gratifying, and this is similar to the enjoyment we get from art or music. And when I was thinking about our conversation today and thinking about kind of the aesthetic value of rhetoric and really artful use of words, I was thinking about my favorite Lady Gaga song, which is a song called Speechless. And there's a line in that song, one of the lyrics, it says, "I can't believe how you looked at me with your Johnny Walker eyes. He's going to get you, and after he's through, there's going to be no love left to rye. And in the official lyrics that are published, she writes rye, R-Y-E. And that's interesting because she references Johnny Walker eyes. And so we have the tie back to, rye whiskey. But what if she means rye, W-R-Y, to pull or to twist or to writhe or to pull something out of something else? There's going to be no love left to maybe derive or twist out of. And so, it just stops you in your tracks and makes you say, oh, what did she mean there? Or do we mean Johnny Walker rye? Or what is she talking about there? Is this the end of love? And so it's just such a satisfying exercise to be able to think through words and lyrics like that. And then lastly, from an advocate's perspective, from a trial lawyer's perspective, rhetorical devices help us simplify and clarify what might be overwhelming or convoluted concepts for our lay jurors. And devices like analogies and metaphors can simplify complex ideas, make them easier to understand and more relatable. And that clarity can be just as satisfying because it reduces the cognitive load and makes us feel less overwhelmed by a topic or less lost in a discussion. Another reason that rhetoric works so well for us as trial lawyers and advocates is that they help our persuasion and helps move our listeners to action and enables them to internalize the theory of our case and make that message part of their core belief system so they can act in a way that would benefit our client or benefit the case or benefit the verdict that we're looking for, or the ruling that we're looking for. And of course, rhetoric creates all kinds of social and cultural connections, which is, again, the most effective communicator is the one who can tailor the message to the audience. And so making a message salient, making it relatable to an audience, making it have some connection to the social reality, the cultural reality of the people that are listening to you, whether they be judges or an arbitration panel or a panel of jurors, that is really the most effective, meaningful, memorable, and persuasive form of communication that I can think of.
So what are the parts of trial that you think are the most natural fit for deploying these rhetorical devices? And why do they work so well in those spots?
Well, I think rhetoric has a place in all trial parts. Realistically, I think it has a place in your visual aids, in creating exhibits for trial and demonstratives. Obviously, rhetoric has a place in what I call your speeches, your opening statements, your closing arguments. That's where you introduce your thematic language. That's where you create the structure of your theory. If you're using a point system, if you are telling a preview of a story and creating some intrigue and wrapping it up in your closing argument. So even through your examinations, we would certainly teach in the Temple program. We teach to incorporate signposts or chapter headings or taglines for the different areas of an examination to cover, and it helps the witness remain on topic at any given point in their testimony. It also helps your listener stay organized and always know where you are. And so when you're using those signposts or those chapter headings or those transitions, that's also a great place to use rhetorical devices, to use thematic language, to incorporate things like alliteration or tricolon or any of the other rhetorical devices that I'd love to tell you about. So really, I don't think there's any place in a trial where a rhetorical device is inappropriate.
So when we think of rhetoric, we often think about the speaking aspect of it when it's delivered orally, like the speaking parts of a trial that you just described. But they can also be used to persuade in written advocacy, such as when you're writing a brief or filing a motion. Does writing rather than speaking change our calculation for how to use rhetorical devices?
A little bit. I think a little bit. Rhetorical devices obviously can be powerful tools both in oral and written advocacy, but their effectiveness depends on how well they're adapted to the medium. And so what I mean by that is that oral rhetoric benefits from the immediacy and the dynamism of the speech. You can read your audience's reaction almost immediately after the words come out of your mouth. But written rhetoric relies on clarity, precision, logical structure, and by understanding the differences and again, understanding the needs of the audience, whether it's an audience that's listening to you talk or an audience that's reading what you say, a reader who has your brief or your memo in their hands, deploying those rhetorical devices strategically can really enhance their persuasiveness. So consider the timing. For instance, in oral advocacy, the speaker controls the pace and the emphasis on any given word or phrase or topic, and they use tone or pauses or body language to enhance that rhetorical effect. But in written advocacy, in brief writing or memoranda of law, the reader is who controls the pace, and they can often and will often revisit certain sections and certain topics for clarity. And so the emphasis in writing relies a lot on text formatting and structure and flow. I mentioned already audience engagement with oral advocacy. The speaker is given almost immediate feedback from the audience, and that can allow for real-time adjustment. Whereas with written advocacy, the writer has to anticipate potential questions and counter arguments. And so the feedback is somewhat delayed or indirect or needs to be anticipated and planned for. Also, when it comes to memory and retention, with oral advocacy, your listeners rely on their auditory memory. And so I would recommend that you make repetition, rhythm, mnemonic devices, that you incorporate them because they're crucial or can be crucial for retention. Whereas with written advocacy, readers can always refer back to the text. And so clarity, coherence, logical progression are more important than repetition necessarily. I think there should also be consideration given to the structure and the organization of the argument, whether it's an oral argument or in writing. So with oral argument, with oral advocacy, clear transitions and the signposts that we spoke about in examinations help your listener follow the flow of the dialogue or of the argument, and that organization supports the natural flow of dialogue or speech. And in writing, the structure has to be logically sound, and it has to have headings and subheadings, paragraphs that guide the reader through the argument. So it just, again, remember that our friend Rhetoric in her blue robe talks about how many iterations of speech, of how many iterations of the work your speech will go through. And so all of these are considerations that need to be given to the setting and the recipient of the message that the message is intended for.
Do you think that you can go too far using rhetorical devices? Like, can it ever be just too much and heavy-handed and actually kind of exhausting to listen to or to read?
I think exhausting is one word. I think hammy and disingenuous and cheesy might be another. Hammy and cheesy. I didn't eat lunch today, but yes, I do think that it can be too much. It can be heavy-handed. So I would say that the overuse or the improper use of rhetorical devices can become tedious, become exasperating for the audience, and so when rhetorical devices are overdone, they can detract from the substance of the argument, and they can appear manipulative or just simply overwhelm or bore your listener. And so, as with any element of a trial, there needs to be a certain, certainly a presence. You need to know how your listener is responding to the argument, and if it looks like they are over your use of a particular rhetorical device or phrase, then stop using it. You need to pay attention to the reaction and to the body language that's happening in the room. And like any good trial lawyer, you need to be ready to pivot. If you were anticipating using that particular phrase or rhetorical device 7 more times in your closing argument, and your jurors are over it, you need to stop and either pick up on something new or know how to transition and pivot to something that will reignite their attention and get them back to baseline and then back on your side of the case.
So it sounds like oral delivery of a rhetorical device or overuse, it's you can't get away with it maybe quite so much in an oral delivery as in something written. Would you agree with that?
I'm not 100% sure. I think that a reader will get just as frustrated or exasperated with the overuse of a rhetorical device in a written piece as a listener will. I think the difference is that you get that immediate feedback from a listener because, believe me, I've had jurors roll their eyes at me. I've had jurors cross their arms and kind of shift their legs or their bodies away from me. And I have to read that body language and say, okay, they're over it. They want something new or they want me to move on to a different topic. And so, in written advocacy, I won't know necessarily how my reader feels about my repeated use of a particular rhetorical device. And that's certainly why it's so important to have friends and colleagues who will give us a fresh set of eyes and give us feedback on anything we've drafted.
So what are some of the rhetorical devices that are kind of the easiest on-ramp, the most accessible ones, and perhaps ones that listeners already are using, but they just don't know the name of it?
Yeah. So I think there are rhetorical devices that we all learn in 5th or 6th grade that are, in our ELA, our English language arts unit, and we don't even appreciate when we're kids that they are actually classical rhetorical devices. So I'm talking about things like similes and metaphors, hyperbole or exaggerated statements. Metaphors, of course, are figures of speech that imply a comparison without using like or as, whereas similes use like or as. Her smile was as bright as the sun, or with a metaphor, time is a thief. So those are some of the perhaps rhetorical devices that we are more familiar with just because they were taught in our English or our grammar classes. We certainly know about rhetorical questions. We can ask rhetorical questions in closing arguments. It gives your jury or your fact finder something to think about as they go back to deliberate. The use of onomatopoeia as well is something that I think is taught in school to young children, which is when a word sounds like the noise being described, like boom, buzz, crunch, sizzle, whoosh, snap, whoosh, right? So and we don't even think of words like boom or buzz or whoosh as rhetorical devices, but they certainly are. And then if you move forward, I think there are some really fascinating, more classical and with their roots in the Greeks, the Greek school of rhetoric, really, I don't even want to say advanced, but just really creative rhetorical devices that I personally love. One of which is called anaphora, and anaphora is the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses. So a perfect example of that was Winston Churchill's speech to the House of Commons in 1940, the we shall fight speech. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills, but we shall not surrender, right? So yes, that repetition of we shall fight, and that's classic anaphora. Another classic takes a spin on anaphora and puts that repetition at the end of a phrase or a sentence. So for instance, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And that's, of course, from the Gettysburg Address from 1863. and we can kind of think about the marriage of anaphora and epistrophe, which is repetition both at the beginning, at the end, and at the end of a word or phrase, and that marriage or that combination of anaphora and epistrophe is something known as simplicity, which is the repetition of the first and last words in a clause over successive clauses. That sounds like a whole lot.
Yeah.
Well,
do you have an example?
I do. Malcolm X gave a speech where he said, "Much of what I say may sound bitter, but it's the truth. Much of what I say may sound like it's stirring up trouble, but it's the truth. Much of what I say might sound like it's hate, but it's the truth." So you have that repetition at the beginning of much of what I say and repetition at the end, but it's the truth. And so you have that beautiful, again, that pattern creation and that repetition and that flow. And it's almost like the ear wants another example of much of what I say, but it's the truth. There creates almost a craving for it. I wanted to say, I think one of my favorite speeches of the 21st century was Barack Obama's speech in New Hampshire the night that he won the New Hampshire primary in January of 2008. And I think that's probably one of the best political speeches that's been written in the 21st century, and one that uses so many rhetorical devices that you could possibly lose count. And the first rhetorical device that he uses is the one I just mentioned, which is epistrophe, the repetition of a word or phrase at the end of successive sentences. So what does he say? He says, "But in the unlikely story that is America, there has never been anything false about hope. For when we have faced down impossible odds, when we've been told that we're not ready or that we shouldn't try or that we can't, generations of Americans have responded with a simple creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and abolitionists as they blazed a trail toward freedom through the darkest of nights. Yes, we can. It was sung by immigrants as they struck out from distant shores and pioneers who pushed westward against an unforgiving wilderness. Yes, we can." Just so delicious. And if you remember when he gave that speech in 2008, I remember watching it live on the news. What happened? The audience that was there knew at the end of each sentence, when he would pause at the period, they knew to start saying, "Yes, we can." And so you talk about a kairotic experience. You talk about giving the audience what they need in any moment. And he knew that they would join him and join in that refrain, that "yes, we can." And so it's just such a beautiful example of perfectly effective rhetoric. And I think notably also in that same speech, he certainly uses metaphor because he references the arc of the moral universe. He uses alliteration. We have seen so much. We could spend the whole hour just talking about "yes, we can," and I bet other people have.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure of it. When I was doing some research on some of these devices too, and examples of my favorites, "Yes, we can" was among my favorite speeches. Barack Obama, you talk about a generational orator and leader, very, very gifted. And he gave different variations of the "Yes, we can" speech throughout his campaign in 2008. And so the excerpt that I found was from his Victory Night speech in 2008. And it's the same stuff, it's the devices that you mentioned, but also antithesis. There's Tricolon. I can read just a little snippet that might make me cry, but that's okay. He said, "And tonight I think about all that this 106-year-old voter he knew of, I think about all that she has seen throughout her century in America, the heartache and the hope, the struggle and the progress, the times we were told that we can't, and the people who pressed on with that American creed, 'Yes, we can.' When there was despair in the Dust Bowl and depression across the land, she saw a nation conquer fear itself with a new deal, new jobs, and a new sense of common purpose. Yes, we can. She was there for the buses in Montgomery, the hoses in Birmingham, a bridge in Selma, and a preacher from Atlanta who told a people that we shall overcome. Yes, we can. Beautiful, beautiful language.
I have chills just hearing you recite it. I really do. And you're right that everything that he gave us in that speech and various iterations of that speech just hit all three pillars of rhetoric. It hits ethos. It established his own credibility as an orator, as a leader. It hit pathos, which is intended to garner the emotional response. We just said, I have chills just hearing you say it. That is that emotional response, that grab. And then lastly, the logical flow. He gives us history. He gives us facts. He gives us statistics, dates, real life concrete examples. And that is what gives you the logic of the argument. Marcy, I wanted to follow up really quickly because you mentioned Tricolon, and you asked what is a device that folks who might not be as familiar or think they are not as well versed in rhetoric, what can they experiment with and incorporate into their own speeches? And I think Tricolon is probably one of the ones that we use most frequently and don't even realize it. And Tricolon
intuitively,
I agree. Yeah. And it's a series of 3 words. That's all it is. It's a series of 3 words, phrases, or sentences that are parallel in structure, length, and rhythm. That's all. And think about so many of our phrases in history and speeches. We use it all the time. Friends, Romans, countrymen, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I came, I saw, I conquered. Even, we already mentioned, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. If you think about even marketing, our brains are wired to receive things in 3s. So if you think about some of the taglines of some products out there, and I'm not sponsored, I'm not pushing any of these products, right? But, Rice Krispie treats, Snap, Crackle, Pop, Toyota, let's go places. The Adidas logo has those 3 stripes, Nike, just do it. Bounty paper towels, the quicker, picker, upper. We respond to phrases in 3s, even images in 3s. There's a photographic concept or practice where the canvas of a photograph is divided into thirds, and most of the action, right, is concentrated in 1/3. And so our eyes, our minds are so responsive to things that are given to us in 3s, like the McDonald's Golden Arches and even their slogan, I'm loving it. So I think that we don't even realize, again, it's intuitive. I don't even think we realize that we make arguments and engage in the use of 3s in conversation, but that is absolutely something that trial lawyers can and should employ, and something that I think fact finders and jurors, listeners are very responsive to.
Another rhetorical device that I really like is one that we do intuitively, and that is turning a negative into a positive, kind of emphasizing the positive aspects of something so that they override the negative. And this device is actually called antanagoge. And a wonderful example of that is from the St. Crispin's Day speech in Henry V by Shakespeare. So just to kind of give you the setup, there were tons of negatives for King Henry to overcome. He is leading an army that's outnumbered, made up of men who are tired, hungry, cold, exhausted, and they're facing a battlefield of mud. And Henry overhears his men grumbling about it, as they would, of course. And he just kind of butts in and he says, hey, wait a minute, that's not how I see it. That's not how I see it at all. And so I'm going to read to you just a few lines from that speech, St. Crispin's Day, where he turns the dread of being the underdogs in this probably doomed battle into sort of a privilege. And so here it goes. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day.
So we're actually so lucky to be here, and other people will wish that they were here with us.
Exactly. I think that entire speech bears listening and comparison with a chart of rhetorical devices, just so that you can kind of get the sense of how to pick up and recognize and then translate into using it yourself in your own needs as a trial lawyer.
You know who else was great with antithesis? Richard Nixon. Of course, antithesis, contrasting two different, often opposite ideas in the same sentence. In his inaugural address, he said, "We find ourselves rich in goods, but ragged in spirit, reaching with magnificent precision for the moon, but falling into raucous discord on earth. We're caught in war, wanting peace. We are torn by division, wanting unity."
Interesting. That's really beautiful.
He had some good speechwriters.
Yeah, he did. So we've talked a little bit about some of these devices, and as I've suggested, maybe you can listen to St. Crispin's Day speech and try to pick out what devices are being used and why they work so well. Where else can we go to further develop our ear for rhetoric? Where can we go for inspiration that translates into developing your skills as a rhetorician in the courtroom?
You know, maybe it's just because I'm the daughter of a school teacher. I just think you have to read. I think you just have to read anything you possibly can. I tell my kids, I don't care if you're reading the back of a cereal box. I just need you reading. So I think paying attention to ads that we're exposed to, paying attention to taglines of movies, reading these great plays, these historic political speeches, reading the poetry of Maya Angelou, the novels of Toni Morrison, the memoirs of Malala. I think that you begin to see and to experience patterns and a lot of the things that we've talked about, rhythm and repetition. And if you pay attention to why a particular excerpt or line grabs you or you're particularly moved by it, stop yourself and say, that's one of the pillars of rhetoric. That's pathos. I have an emotional response there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a positive response either. It doesn't have to be one that gives you chills or, makes you feel the warm and fuzzies. It can be one that makes you feel, fired up and angry too. We are recording this in a time when there is a certain political convention happening. And I've been listening to those speeches, and they are brilliant from a rhetorical perspective, regardless of your politics, right? You have to listen to the words and how messages are being, frankly, spun. And so I think paying attention to lyrics, to song lyrics, even printing out some of the lyrics from your favorite songs or your favorite poems, or going back and listening to some of the speeches that we've talked about, reading the classics like Shakespeare and some of the other OG rhetoricians that we spoke about. I think that just really trains the eye and the ear and the mind to become much more receptive and cognizant of these rhetorical devices when they're deployed.
Are you familiar with Dr. Marty Groth? I think he's a retired professor of some kind, and he's written all of these books on essentially wordplay. I mean, we're talking about wordplay here.
It can be, yeah.
So he's written books that are just all about metaphors, like metaphors in literature or in speeches or in TV shows, in movies. And he's collected them into a book. He's also got one on chiasmus, which is another type of rhetorical device where it concerns word order. So I guess the best way to describe it is by giving you an example. You reverse the word order. And here's an example. Never let a fool kiss you, or a kiss fool you.
Oh, that's fantastic. I
also have one from Ronald Reagan. He said that nations do not mistrust each other because they are armed. They are armed because they mistrust each other. I think that's a really fun rhetorical device to play with, too.
I think another great example would be JFK's "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country."
Yes, that's a classic, isn't it? Do you have any favorite rhetorical devices that you like to use as a writer?
So I didn't realize until I started thinking about our conversation today that there are a few that I go back to time and time again. And I think we talked about Tricolon and the use of threes. Sometimes I tinker and I try to use four, and it feels like too many. But I do use threes a lot. I use solipsis a lot, where you use a one word, which is often a verb, but you use it in two different ways or apply two different meanings to it. And the ones that we mentioned before, the repetition in terms of an aphora at the beginning of a sentence, or epistrophe at the end of the sentence, or solipsis when you pair the repetition both at the beginning and at the end of a clause on successive or repeated clauses. So I think those are probably my top 5 that I use most often, just because they're fun and they start to kind of roll off your tongue.
So we talked about Lady Gaga and Alanis Morissette, Barack Obama, among a few others. Who else do you consider a really great modern day rhetorician who we may not think of in that way?
Well, don't laugh, but I don't think that we can make it through the year 2024 and be talking about wordplay and effective use of rhetorical devices without talking about Taylor Swift. Oh. Taylor Swift, and I will admit it, I am not a Swiftie. I have not attended the Eras Tour. I have not seen her live, but she is one of, I think we can agree, she is one of the most influential artists of our time. She is certainly a prolific songwriter and poet, and I have listened to her latest album, The Tortured Poets Department, all 31 tracks of it, and I will give her credit where credit is due, that she employs rhetorical devices beautifully and very effectively and in a varied way. And she has a song that is not on Tortured Poets. It's an earlier song. I think it's from the Red album. I think it's from the Red album. I'm not a Swiftie, so if I'm wrong about that, don't come at me. But it's called All Too Well. And I think that I mentioned, one of my favorite devices is an aphora. And she mentions she uses an aphora by repeating the phrase, "I remember it all too well" throughout. There's another song, I'm blanking, I don't know what album it's from, but it's called Mine, and she uses antithesis really beautifully. "You made a rebel of a careless man's careful daughter." So made a rebel, careless man's careful daughter. It kind of goes up and down and up, and it's just really beautiful flow and patterning. So again, I say, listen to lyrics, print them out, pay attention to them, pay attention to what moves you, what grabs you. But I do think that Taylor Swift, regardless of how you feel about her music and her ever-presence in pop culture, she is a modern day rhetorician.
That is an interesting way to describe her. It explains why she moves so many people, and so many people feel like she understands them so perfectly. So we thought that we would play around a little bit with rhetorical devices ourselves for this episode and put a few pop culture villains on trial. And we decided that we would each choose a man and a woman, and then come up with 2 memorable lines, one for the prosecution and one for the defense, that use rhetorical devices. So I would like to start this demo with, I think you chose Walter White, am I right, for the man?
I did. I chose Walter White for my male villain from Breaking Bad, of course.
Yeah. So what did you come up with for the prosecution of Walter White?
So I have 2. For the pros, I said Walter White chose to break bad, break the law, break the lives of those around him.
I love that.
And that's an aphora. Again, and I'm noticing that I use it so much, but the repetition of break the at the beginning.
Yeah, fantastic.
Other one I came up with for Walter White is Walter White produced and peddled and profited from a poison that devastated families and ruined futures and shattered our community. And that is the combination of polysyndeton, which incorporates a conjunction between clauses. So instead of saying Walter White produced, comma, peddled, comma, and profited from, we introduce that conjunction where we don't necessarily need it. So produced and peddled and profited from a poison that devastated families and ruined futures and shattered our community. And again, that the overuse, or the repeated use, I should say, of the conjunction creates a little bit of flow. And I also tried to incorporate some alliteration there with produced and peddled and profited from a poison.
Yeah, very nice. I also noticed the rule of three, Tricolon.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, very well done. Here's mine. I'll try to measure up. Here we go. And I ask just one thing from you. When you hear Walter White was a dying man, when you hear, but Walter only supplied a demand, when you hear, but Walter did it for his family, you must say, that changes nothing.
I love that.
So I did the rule of three, the tricolon, with 3 words or phrases in parallel structure. When you hear, when you hear, when you hear, but Walter, but Walter, but Walter. Okay, so defense. What do you have for the defense of Walter?
In your example, sorry, I don't want to go back, but in your example, you gave us solipsis too, because you gave us repetition at the beginning and at the end. So when you hear, but Walter, when you hear, but Walter. So you had solipsis in there too.
Oh, well. See, once you get rolling, it gets a lot easier, and you're just you don't even know what you're doing.
It's muscle memory. It really is just playing around with words and seeing what flows well.
Yeah, so people should not be afraid to try it. Let's move on to defense of Walter White, if there is one. You go ahead.
I had a hard time with the defense of Walter White because it's so hard to defend him.
Yeah.
So while some may see Walter White as a criminal, his actions were not driven by malice, but by a desperate desire to provide for his family's future in the face of dire consequences.
So what devices did you use there?
Yeah, it's hard. This one's hard. Antithesis, because the beginning part of the sentence is, while some may see Walter White as a criminal, and we are contradicting and juxtaposing that with his actions were not driven by malice, but by a desperate desire to provide for his family's future. So it acknowledges his criminality, but gives something of an excuse for it.
Yeah.
But defending Walter White is super hard.
Oh, it is hard. And I came up with something similar with antithesis, because it kind of seems the easiest. Mine is Walter White had nothing to lose but his life.
Oh.
Because of his illness.
See? So, that gives you the pathos. You have that emotional response, like, oh, he is a sick man who's trying to do something for his legacy, his family, I don't know.
Okay, so let's move on to females. Our female pop culture villain. You chose
Beatrix Kiddo, the bride from Kill Bill.
Yeah, she's a good one. What have you got for the prosecution?
So I'm thinking that she's being prosecuted for I'm sorry if I'm spoiling this for anyone, but I'm assuming that she's being prosecuted for the 5-finger death punch that she administers at the end. And maybe I won't say who she administers that blow to, but it results in a death. We won't tell you whose. So that was the case that I had in my mind thinking about this closing. Beatrix Kiddo delivered a deadly blow, breaking both the law and a heart. And that's solipsis.
Wow, I love that. That is startling. That's great.
Using a verb with two different ways, or applying it to two different things.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That really, that kind of grabs you at the heart, ironically. So I came up with one, too, for the prosecution of Beatrix Kiddo, and it goes like this. Beatrix Kiddo is the Black Mamba. Kiddo is a predator, She attacks and kills when she feels threatened. She strikes over and over and over again. She's highly venomous and a stone-cold killer. Make no mistake, Beatrix Kiddo is a deadly viper. She's the Black Mamba.
I love that.
And so that's metaphor.
Metaphor, absolutely. It's funny. I was playing with Beatrix because she's so much fun. She's such a great character, and I thought about the theme of vengeance too, and thought about personification and making her vengeance. She sought vengeance. She delivered vengeance. She became vengeance, and in her quest, she took a life with calculated precision and unrelenting resolve.
So that leads into the defense. What did you have to say about her for defense?
Beatrix Kiddo was betrayed by her mentor, hunted by her enemies, and left for dead by the man she loved. That was Tricolon. A form of solipsis, Beatrix Kiddo fought for her life and for her child's future, battling both a tyrant and her own fears. And lastly, using epistrophe, Beatrix Kiddo fought for her freedom, she fought for her child, and she fought for her life.
Oh, those are really good. And you actually went above and beyond with 3 examples, so extra credit to you. Well done. Here is mine for the defense. Let us not forget that Beatrix Kiddo is the original victim here. It was, after all, Beatrix who was shot in the head on her wedding day. And Beatrix who was unconscious when her daughter was born and stolen away from her. And Beatrix, who was repeatedly assaulted in the hospital, in a coma, for 4 years. So you tell me, has this woman not earned her eye for an eye? And that is sententia, which is evoking a famous saying to prove your point.
And it's funny because you have what a great reference to eye for an eye, and someone, again, we don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but someone in Kill Bill loses an eye, right?
Yep. Yep, that's right.
Great reference.
I think that all the questions I've asked you have been really fun, but typically we do save 2 really fun questions for the end, and we are here with those. So the first question is, have you been watching anything great on TV lately, or what have you been reading for pleasure? Or both?
Yeah, so I have 4 little kids. So Paw Patrol is on pretty frequently, as is Jordan Matter on YouTube. But when everyone goes to bed and I can get the TV to myself for a few minutes, I'm obsessed with The Bear on Hulu. And season 3 was released at the end of June, and I tore through all of season 3. And so I make it my Friday night treat to kind of just pick a random episode and watch any episode from any of the 3 seasons. So I love The Bear. I love the city of Chicago. I love the restaurant industry, the service industry. It's just wonderful character development. I think it's fantastic. And as for a book, I really need to give a shout out to just a masterpiece that I read recently called The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. When I say masterpiece, I don't say that lightly. It's just a beautiful tapestry of vibrant characters and historical detail. It's sentimental to me because it's set in Pennsylvania in the late 1930s. I'm a Philadelphia, Pennsylvania native, but the author, James McBride's storytelling is just magical, and it effortlessly blends humor and heartbreak and hope. And he explores the themes of community and identity and resilience and courage, and really exploring each very multi-layered character's struggles and triumphs with a lot of empathy and insight. And it's a timeless story, and it's a timely story given our current society and current events. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I lost 2 nights of sleep because I stayed up through the night for 2 consecutive nights just reading this book. I could not put it down. It just lit my soul on fire. And Then when I was ultimately done, I just kind of laid there and stared at the ceiling for a while and thought to myself, what did I just go through? Because it was one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. And it will just stay with me forever and ever and ever. And, I won't give anything away by saying this, but there's a beginning of one chapter that starts kind of in the present tense as to what's happening to the character then and there. And the author so seamlessly takes us through like a 30-year flashback. And then all of a sudden, we are back on the doorstep where we left the character. And it was just one of those moments where I said, how did he do that? How did he do that? It's just magnificent writing. And it's just a book that I think everyone should read and thank the author for, and worth losing many nights of sleep over. I would do it all over again.
How would you spend $1 million? All frills, no bills.
I'd travel. This world is such a big, beautiful place, and there are so many places on my bucket list that I haven't yet seen, and I don't know that I'll get there. It's just a dream to see so many of the beautiful places in this world. And so if I had $1 million and could throw caution to the wind, I would hop on a plane and pretty much just put my finger on a globe and spin it and end up wherever I end up.
Well, may the odds be ever in your favor. I hope it goes your way.
Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you again for coming on board. It was such a delight to talk to you.
Oh, this was so much fun. I so appreciate your time. I loved being here with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And that is a wrap on this month's episode. Do check out the show notes for the links that we discussed, like the St. Crispin's Day speech and the Queen philosophy. There is also a rhetorical devices worksheet that Marian Grace put together for listeners of the podcast that lists some of the rhetorical devices we presented in this episode, along with a short explanation of what they are, the effect of the actual device, and then a famous example or two of it in use. So many thanks again to Marian Grace for sharing this resource with all of us. I will be using it myself in my writings here at NITA. Next month is a milestone birthday for May the Record Reflect. We're turning 5 years old, and for that we have a special episode recorded with a member of our Board of Trustees, and we will also welcome back a previous guest of the pod. We'll be talking about building trial skills through pro bono work and the ethics of lawyering. We are so glad to have you listening and learning, and hope that you will share this episode or any of the previous 57 episodes with your friends and colleagues. Until next month's episode, happy lawyering! May the Record Reflect is a NITA Studio 71 production. NITA, we are advocacy enhanced, mentorship reimagined. Welcome to the community.